This is a victory for CNN, Wolf, but more importantly, a victory for the free press. Less than 2 weeks after that post-midterms news conference, when Trump was desperate to change the subject and he kicked Jim Acosta out of the White House, the press pass has been restored, not just temporarily like it was on Friday, but now permanently restored by the White House.
You're listening to the Laura Ingraham Show, 855-40-LAURA. Well, Brian Stetler is very excited because he gets to crow on TV that, well, Jim Acosta has his press pass back. But where do you go to get your reputation back? I'm sorry, but it's not all about Jim Acosta. It's about getting information to the public in a at least somewhat orderly fashion. And the president has been extremely accessible, both in the breadth of these press conferences and, frankly, the number of press conferences he's done just in the past few months. More so, in my recollection, than Barack Obama. Especially, there was a time, I think a year and a half, where the press was grousing about how the President Obama was not doing enough press conferences, and people were very frustrated by that. But nevertheless, this has been something of a political football for the administration, dealing with what ended up being a very unpleasant situation in that press conference last week. Joining us now, an old friend, Major Garrett. He's a chief White House correspondent for CBS News and author of the book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride. It's available now, and you can find it on our website or on our Facebook page, and he's with us now. Hey, Major, how are you? Long time no speak, my friend.
I know, Laura, and you said it right. I am an old friend, very old, getting older all the time.
Oh, shut up. No, you're not. Major, I have to talk to you. Talk about what it was like, what it's been like covering the White House, and you do a lot of this in your book. But clearly, we're at this very odd point in the American media, where you have opinion shows like mine, and then you have reporters who are supposed to be reporting and doing investigative work and following up with sources and so forth. But instead, what we see oftentimes is, and I won't name names, but oftentimes we see more of a debating society at some of these press conferences, where the reporters take on the role of a kind of debater engaged in repartee with the president. What are your thoughts?
So, I've been doing this at the White House for a long time. First president I covered was Bill Clinton in 2000. I covered George W. Bush, Barack Obama for Fox and for CBS, and now Donald Trump. So I know my way around these encounters with the president. Some are more formal than others, but they're always, in my opinion, defined by the presidency. I'm not elected by anyone. The President of the United States is. The President of the United States is the dominant political figure in our country and commands and demands respect. And the interactions with the president are designed to accomplish one thing, and you just mentioned it, Laura, and one thing only: inform the public. The quality of your question is defined entirely, in my opinion, by the answer it elicits. And does the public learn something it didn't know before about where the president or the administration is approaching an issue, or the president's current thoughts about a breaking story? That's the whole point of being here. That's the number one obligation of the privilege of being a White House correspondent, is asking the most powerful political figure in the country regular questions, tough questions, and teaching the public about what the president is going to do or thinking about doing. And if you don't get answers from the president, by definition, you're not fulfilling that number one obligation. So I've always approached this very simply. I ask the questions and I listen for the answers. And then the public decides, and I back away.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems, again, that I don't think this president is upset at tough questions. I really don't see, and last night I was critical of him on Fox for some of the recent things he's tweeted and kind of getting off focus in a couple of ways, but I think he doesn't mind that. I mean, whether it was after the Kavanaugh thing when he was or during the Kavanaugh thing, I think when he was in New York at the UN, or even last week when he took 60-plus questions. I don't think he minds the tough questions. I really don't. I'm sure he doesn't, because I've experienced it. And to your earlier point,
and I can say this with absolute authority because I covered a good portion of the beginning and the first 2 years and the last 2 years of the Obama presidency. This president is more accessible to White House reporters than Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. There's just no competition. He loves to interact with the press. One of the interesting things that's, I think, hard sometimes for the public and even the media to digest is the president has a truly not hate-love relationship, but love-hate relationship with the media. He loves it more than he dislikes it. And he is thoroughly accomplished at driving the message the way he wants to drive it. Does every Republican strategist think that's the way he ought to drive it? No. But he's very capable of handling tough questions, lots of questions on lots of different topics, and driving the message the way he wants to drive it. And as far as accessibility of this president, there's no comparison. He will take questions sometimes 2 or 3 times in one day. There'd be days when I wouldn't see Barack Obama as president take questions from the White House press corps. Days and days, and this president does. So, and people have complained that Sarah doesn't brief as often as press secretary. Laura, I've always said this. I'll take the president over the press secretary any day of the week.
Well, Carl Bernstein was saying, I guess, on Sunday that press briefings are just propagandist exercises and that cable outlets shouldn't even air them. What are your thoughts there?
That's not true. And I'd love for Carl to be back here doing work in the beat to see what it's like. The press briefing does give a chance for lots of different reporters who may not get called on as frequently by the president to get their questions in on lots of different topics. And the press secretary has to field all that. And there's often interchanges where on the third or fourth go-round of a certain set of questions, new information is extracted from the press secretary. It's not propaganda. It's interaction of the press corps and the White House. Is there a sort of stenographer aspect to it? That's one of the long-standing criticisms of White House reporters. You're just stenographers. Well, look, if the White House says it, by definition, it's important. So stenography is not incidental to informing the public. But probing and getting different answers to emerging issues is part of the job here, and the press briefing is a place to do that. But I would rather throw those questions at the president than the press secretary. And around here right now, under President Trump, we get a chance to do that frequently. In
your chapter about race, which I've had a chance to look at, you talk about Trump's, you talk about the liberal doomsayers and the caricature has come to life and the horrors are no longer celluloid but stalking the countryside. The critique of the conservative demagogues asserted they were simplistic, ruthless, dangerous, and hypocritical. The left sees all of this and much more in Trump. As to the black and white movie demagogues of the 50s and 60s, Trump bears somewhat of a resemblance. And you talk about the debates over immigration and border security. Expand on that.
So I mentioned 3 movies from the 50s and 60s that were written by liberal writers of that time, screenwriters and those who participated with screenwriters, creating these caricatures of conservative demagogues of that time. And I say for the left now, they sort of see Trump in that light, like these are the worst fears of the 50s and 60s come to light. I don't say that Trump is a representation or an actual reflection of those sort of 1950s, 60s era liberal doomsday scenarios about what a conservative demagogue could or would do in America. But I say the left views Trump that way. I also in the race chapter say only Trump knows what his racial motivations are. I also describe in the chapter how when he gets these questions about race or his orientation toward racial divisions in the country, he frequently falls back on economic remedies, answering the race question with a better economy will solve a lot of these issues. I think that's where this president defaults on a lot of these questions. And I write in the book, based on lots of conversations with people who work around the president, that he has a kind of fatalism about solving, quote unquote, racial divisions in this country. I don't think he thinks rhetoric or speeches make any real difference there.
Right, but it's not. Is it fatalism or is it realism? I mean, I think if you.
It might be both. It might be both. It all depends on your point of view.
Well,
fatalism in the sense that not that we are fatalistic and we are doomed to this division, but that speeches from a president or even the election of the first African American president is not quote unquote going to solve this. He believes by far the remedial action that a president can take most effectively deals with the economy and a better economic status for Hispanic Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, whatever. And that's sort of his default position on that. So I don't think he broods on the race-solving burden of the president.
Well, it was a result.
I'm not sure he interprets it as a burden in the first place.
I would put it that he believes that his role is to try to get government out of the way when possible and make it easier for people to raise their standard of living. And that when you raise individual standard of living, they find new opportunities, new alliances from people from all walks of life. And, I've known him for, I guess, almost, I met him in 2000, so 18 years. And I would say this, like, with everywhere he has been and everything he's done and the ups and downs of business and everything else, he's pretty good. If he's a racist, he's really great actor. He's really good at hiding it.
Yeah,
really good at that. This is where liberals always go overboard on this. People just don't believe these. I mean, people who are racist, like a sliver of the activist hate Trump crowd believes he's a racist, and I think most other Americans might. They might agree with him, might disagree with him, but anytime you say someone's a racist or even imply it, it shuts down conversation and it stokes animosity.
Precisely. And as you may have had a chance to see in the book, if you haven't, I hope you will, I write in the book, when in this Trump era, people are hounded out of restaurants because they work for this White House, liberals have got to ask themselves the question, wait a minute. When the civil rights movement was about people being able to, without interference or harassment, eat at places that they were denied access to, how could liberalism construct a sense of justice about hounding people who work for an elected White House out of a restaurant? I mean, what kind of construct does that make sense in any way? And I lay that before the reader. Like, we're reaching this point where that which was considered just and defensible and worth fighting for in the civil rights era is now somehow can be used as a weapon against people who work for a certain elected White House. That just seems loose. That just seems crazy to me.
Now, in the big meeting, of course, coming up after Thanksgiving with President Xi, you write a lot about the initial meetings with him and where the policy is going, and I think this will go down, again, undercovered by the media, American media, who are obsessed with whether Acosta has his pass or whatever. But that will go down as one of his most important, and I certainly hope, achievements in actually taking on what China has done to this country with rank stealing of intellectual property, obviously the massive trade deficit and so forth. And China is now hurting, as the Bloomberg and The Guardian, all these newspapers have come to the conclusion in recent weeks that China is hurting much more than the United States because of these tariffs. I'm happy to. I'm happy. What's that? Go ahead.
There's not a chapter on trade in the book because the trade discussion in the first year, because the book is largely about what happened in the first year of the Trump presidency, was unresolved. But I hope to write a second book about the back 2 years of the first term of the Trump presidency, and trade will definitely be.
No, I just was reading about the meeting that you talked about, Jared Kushner, and we were just talking about
all
China.
The early stuff during the transition, which laid a foundation for the first Trump-Xi summit in Mar-a-Lago. All of that is in rich detail. Yeah.
Oh, I assumed wrongly. Well, you better do the trade thing in the next book, because I want to know what you think about that. Major Garrett, thank you so much for spending some time with us. Your book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride, it's kind of a historical read of the challenges and yes, the successes of some of what's happened over the last few years. Both the Democrats and Republicans are, they're always at each other's throat, but it's a really good perspective and a really neat framing of what's happened, and it's not all that complicated. You can understand it. And it's a historical read as well. Major Garrett, thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving with Laura and your family, and I just hope you have a great time. Come back soon, would you?
I will. Thanks, and all the best to you, Laura.
All right, and get the book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride. Stay with us.
The Laura Ingraham Show.